Hello. Is this on? Yeah, I can go now. Yeah, do the intro. Okay, hit it. In a world overpopulated with podcasts by bored celebrities that couldn't think of anything better to do during the lockdown, two intrepid columnists from the Winnipeg Free Press put their careers on the line to fight fake news media apathy and bring you the unmitigated truth.
Dan, what the hell are you doing?
Hey, Niigaan. I was just trying to record the intro for our new podcast.
But what exactly are you trying to do? It sounds like a trailer for a Jordan Peele film or something. I don't know. Is this really working for me?
Really? I kind of thought it was cool, but okay, if you're so smart, what would you do for the intro?
First, I would just tell people straight. Hello, welcome, bonjour, tanse, to the very first episode of Niigaan and the Lone Ranger. And then I'd play some really cool music, just like this.
The Winnipeg Free Press proudly presents, in partnership with CJNU 93.7 FM, Niigaan and the Lone Ranger. Here are your hosts, Niigaan Sinclair and Dan the Lone Ranger Lett.
We thought the first thing that'd be really interesting is if we kind of introduced each other to the podcast audience. So, Niigaan Sinclair is a nationally recognized academic. He is an award-winning columnist. He is a leading national voice among Indigenous people and on Indigenous reconciliation. And he is the guy whose coattails I am going to ride to podcast fame.
And this is Dan Lett. Dan is from Toronto. Originally. And now an adopted Winnipegger. He's forgiven for coming from the center of the universe, but now he's making his home here in my old neighborhood, actually. And you're a hockey ref. You're a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. You're also just a great dad and a family person. And I'm really happy to be here to share this journey with you as we head out on the trail there, Lone Ranger.
Man.
Not only have we created this birth of this journey, we've remade the past. We're re-envisioning the past to take forth on the journey of investigating politics and media and all the things in between.
And, I think we need to deal with the elephant in the room, first off, which is the name of the podcast. Which I don't know that it'll be quite as controversial as I'm hoping it'll be. But I do think it's interesting that when we originally had a discussion about, and I will say, for better or for worse, it was your idea.
It was totally my idea.
Okay.
And it was at the end of one of your backyard parties where it was birthed. That's right.
So where there may or may not have been cold beverages served. But anyways, so, you suggested Niigaan and the Lone Ranger. And then when we stopped laughing about it, we kind of realized, wow, that would be really cool. So I think, we then kind of went through a period of very soft focus grouping with the people that we knew. So I went to my friends and family and kind of said, I'm thinking about doing a podcast with this guy. And this is what we're going to call it. And, honestly, I got a combination of, and I'll say, most of the people I consulted with were not Indigenous. And I would say that the best word to describe the reaction was mortified.
Well, the reaction that I got was I went to Indigenous peoples and all across the board, everybody loved it. They particularly like that you're unnamed, is what they particularly like, because the Lone Ranger, of course, doesn't get a name. But in this case, the Indigenous person who ends up doing all the work, just like back in the day, and probably during this podcast, I'll do all of the work. Actually, so far, I think you've done all of the work, but that's what I like, is that we've reversed all the roles. Of course, the story of the Lone Ranger is that Tonto saves the Lone Ranger from being murdered. that there was 5 or 6 Rangers. There was a shootout. And at the end, Tonto takes the last living Ranger and nurses him back to health and names him the Lone Ranger. Yeah. So I'm very happy to give you the title as the only living friend of mine that survived the shootout at the Free Press as my new Lone Ranger.
Well, and I'm very happy to be the anonymous second banana sidekick. I mean, whatever. It is true. Like, for those folks listening to the podcast, if you look at the photo that accompanies our podcast, you will see some funny expressions. So you'll see me looking kind of stunned, which is actually just my, natural state of being. But then you'll see Niigaan pointing stoically off sort of to the horizon. And that's actually a little inside joke that we put together. So we've recreated partly a still from the original 50s TV show, Lone Ranger, where the Lone Ranger is pointing stoically and Tonto's just kind of standing there. So,
And so this will be the re-envisioning and the rethinking, the remaking right here from ground zero of reconciliation, the big conversations, the big talks. Everything that we're going to talk about is not just right here in Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, but it's also going to be we're going to talk about much bigger things. We're going to talk about the country. We're going to talk about the United States. We're going to talk about all the different things that go into media as being a columnists. 2 of the columnists at the Winnipeg Free Press, we're kind of in the thick of it. So we're in the thick of the issues here in this territory. So we hope to not only talk about this place, but all the other places.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that, as Niigaan mentioned, I'm originally from Toronto, a hold for applause. But it is like, I lived and worked in Calgary for a while before I came here. I've now been more than 3 decades on the prairies. And it's taught me a couple of interesting things about the way the country's national news economy works. National News Watch, for example, which, like a lot of journalists, I check in a couple times a day. I mean, really, like a 10-car pileup on the 401 makes National News Watch. But, real news from Saskatchewan, Manitoba, doesn't really qualify until violent crime, natural disasters. I'm borrowing from a Rick Salutin narrative of a number of years back. He wrote this in the Globe and Mail. And it's true, it's got to be sexual assault that is,
mass killings.
It's
got to be a forest fire that kills, displaces communities. Really, to make any news in Toronto, it's got to be the worst possible story. So no surprise, Toronto sends reporters to come and visit Winnipeg for a couple of days and then make huge declarations on the city, like we're the most racist city in the galaxy, or we're the most violent city, or a murder capital, and they don't see what this place really is, which is, this is the heartland. This is the first step of Canada. The very first place that's created out of Confederation, the first treaty, the first province. And so as a result, in this place, you see the biggest footprints of what Canada's first steps are. And you also see, frankly, some of the biggest overcompensation of Canada's first steps, like these monstrosity buildings, these incredible, big, huge statements the country's trying to make with the train line. And as a result, you see all of history just living forth in this place that I think much of Canada really doesn't know about. The fact that in this place, there's dialogue, there's issues, there's also solutions that are really unprecedented, never before seen otherwise in Canada. And we just finished September 30th, the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, and there was more gatherings here, more activity here, more leadership from Indigenous and non-Indigenous circles heading in a direction that I think is very productive and very useful, and just not happening in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. And so this place is really what I want to focus upon during this podcast, is not only are we riding the trail together, but we're also observing, I think, a community that is presenting many solutions to the country.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most frustrating things about Winnipeg, and to a lesser extent Manitoba, is that the people who live here, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, a lot of them don't think very highly of the place. And, so I sort of understand when I go back to see my family in Toronto. I understand it when they go, okay, so that's really great. You've been in Winnipeg for 30 years. So when are you coming back? And I sort of understand, and I love Toronto. It's still, I would say, still kind of my home, right? I don't want to live there, but it is sort of my home. But I also sort of say, you guys, are Toronto is independent and unique because it's big. It has a big footprint. Winnipeg is independent and unique because there's nothing else around it. We're 7 hours away from the city that's big, the next biggest city to us, which is Minneapolis. Royal Charter Ballet, Royal Charter Theater Company, great music, great food. And the real advantage is, here, I have art on the wall from artists that I know. I have music in my computer from musicians I know. I go out to eat in restaurants where I know the people making the food. And I get to do all these things. And honestly, my family in Toronto, it's a completely, they're so much more divorced from the community. We're connected in a way that people that haven't traveled much or lived in other places wouldn't get this. They wouldn't understand the visceral connections and how short they are between what the community is and what it could be, and the discussions going on. And I don't know. I hope we can highlight some of that, and we can bring it to a national audience.
One of the most challenging things is the jobs that we do as columnists at the provincial newspaper, the Highline provincial newspaper. You and I walk in different areas. We're right now in the middle of 2 major elections, which are all happening very quickly from when we're taping this. We have the mayoral election, and then the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs Grand Chief election, which has got no coverage. I was watching all of the speeches, and of course, no media is there. No one's covering that particular area. But, this is the place in which there's major changes happening. There's a big page being turned at the moment, really from a younger generation to taking over for an older generation. And there's a critical mass of the younger generation, which is really forcing a lot of change. But you were talking about the challenges of, or the wonderfulness of being in Winnipeg. Mm-hmm. But that's also one of the biggest challenges, is that our kids play sports or play music with literally the people that we're writing about.
Yeah.
And so here, we've got the politician who we just wrote a column about, scathing report of this scandal. And then we got to go see that person at the hockey rink that night, or the curling rink, or at the orchestra hall, or whatever. And so it's this really, Winnipeg is this very intimate place, but it's this place that it's a little bit hard to navigate politics. It's hard because in our jobs, we have to give our opinion. And I think that many people may not always want to hear our opinions, but I'm really glad that the Free Press has given us support to be able to do this work, to get a little bit more information out there. And then also the rest of the country can hear about some of the intersections and the issues that are happening within this place as well.
It's going to take us a little while to kind of get our jam going on this thing. I think that our feature interview this week is going to be with former Manitoba Premier Gary Doer, former Canadian Ambassador to the United States Gary Doer, and he's going to, for any of you who want to go to FanDuel or Bet360 and put some money down on the U.S. midterms, Premier and former Ambassador Doer will give you his best guesses on what's going to happen in the U.S. midterm elections. And I will warn you now, he has an alarming rate of accuracy in predicting the outcome of elections. So stay tuned for that. I think as well in coming up as well, we have a feature of the podcast that we're calling The Storytellers. And this is an opportunity for people that I know and Niigaan knows who share their stories with us. I mean, that's one of the greatest blessings of being a journalist. It's having people share their experiences, share their stories. And I think, good journalists do a good job of telling other people's stories. But there are, like when people tell their own stories, there's a shot to the solar plexus. You know what I mean? Like it's like an impression or their little slice of their perspective into that story. Absolutely. Yeah. And so we have a segment where, we're not really putting any limit on the amount of time, but it's going to be an interesting person telling a deeply, deeply interesting and personal story in their own words. No interruption from you and me. I don't know what we're going to do while they're telling their story. They're going to have to seal us away in a room somewhere, so we can't like wave and interject. But yeah,
and our hope is to get everyone from politicians to many names that you know and some names that you don't know, but people who have had really remarkable, profound experiences and can teach us a little bit about what is it like to be a person in 2022? What's it like to be a politician? What's it like to be an activist? What's it like to be an artist?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the, and off the top, we had a little fun about the podcast universe, which is like when we talked about doing a podcast, it's daunting. I mean, there's tens of thousands of podcasts, and oh my God, like every reasonably famous person who had a little downtime during the pandemic did a podcast. And I mean, there's some really great examples of like where people are really wired for it and they do, but man, oh man, there's a lot of
there's some
stuff.
really terrible.
Holy cow. And I did exhaustive research and, I love Bill Maher. I think he's brilliant, but somebody ought to put that podcast out of its misery because it, seriously, like it's angry and disorientated. And anyways, I digress. And this is where I point to the producer and say, and we can cut that out in post-production, can't we? Yeah. I'll be happy, actually, if Bill Maher,
well,
if I get like a letter of intent from Bill Maher, like I will think that we've accomplished. We're hitting.
I doubt you're getting
weight.
A letter. I doubt you. But hey, this brings up a really good point here.
Yeah.
That when the original Lone Ranger came out in the 1950s, that there was a set of guidelines that were issued by the producers
and a creed.
It was actually called a creed. That's right.
Yeah. Well, it's two. It's a creed and guidelines.
Oh, and guidelines. Okay. Yeah. Well, I just want us to go over that because I really think that I'm not worried about myself. I'm really just worried about you. I'm worried about the things that you have to do.
I'm worried about me too.
I'm worried about the things that the rules that you have to follow as the Lone Ranger, the other half of our podcast. Because here's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
I'm just going to be indigenous and I'm just going to go out there and save the day half the time. The other half of the time, I'm just going to let you, face off against all the other criticism and so on.
Absolve some of us for our sins.
I'll be there right beside you. I'm just kidding. But this creed, there's some rules here, so I think we should just review them.
Yep.
This is from the real life creed and guidelines from the Lone Ranger in 1933.
And just by way of a little background, Lone Ranger started as a radio serial in 1933. Eventually, it franchised out comic books, animated series, TV series, movies. For the purpose of this podcast, there's a huge asterisk on here that the makers of this podcast, anybody associated with it, neither endorse nor recognize the fact that Johnny Depp was ever involved in a project related to the Lone Ranger. As far as we're concerned, it never happened.
No.
And based on like the 7 people who paid to see it, I'm pretty sure the movie essentially was The Tree That Fell in the Forest, right?
It predates that.
Well before that. Yeah.
If anybody gets a chance to see this, the creed of the Lone Ranger, it's actually somewhat weirdly progressive for the 1930s. It talks about how, you've got to treat all people equal. So this is me just reminding you there. Your job is to be prepared physically, mentally, and morally to fight when necessary.
For that which is right.
For that which is right. And which is right is what I tell you is right. That a man should make the most of what equipment he has. I'm not going to talk about the double entendre with that one. And then, of course, it talks about perhaps the most controversial statement that this government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall live always.
Yeah, I mean, like as much like there are some visionary elements of the creed. I mean, I like where I think, and especially like if you also look at the guidelines, because the creators of the Lone Ranger also for anybody licensing it for another medium, they had to, the guidelines were very important. The Lone Ranger never shot to kill, only to wound. Never appeared was never allowed to appear in a saloon or anywhere near alcohol. Well, so it's very realistic, of course. And then, but also what was interesting was that they said, that the enemies of the Lone Ranger, and I'm using the words of the original guidelines, will always be American, so as not to offend any minority group. Now, remember, this is the 1930s. So by American, I'm going to go way out on a limb here and say they're saying white guys. So that because that is part of the origin story of the Lone Ranger. He wasn't bushwhacked by Native Americans. He was bushwhacked by a no good band of
dressed in black.
Like a gang, So, and it, that part of it, like it kind of lingers in my mind as like back in the 30s, they must have thought these guys were nuts for putting these guidelines or these restrictions on the use of licensing the use of the character. But it also, so it comes back, I'm going to come back to the creed now, which is that, and I'm reading a little into it. Maybe you will too, but that sooner or later, somewhere, somehow, we must settle with the world and make payment for what we have taken. So I found that to be oddly poetic, and I'm just going to say it. I think he's a reconciliationist. I think the Lone Ranger.
Let's avoid the whole. He is the dream of progress versus the savage Indian. But. Yeah,
but I do think that it is, even today in the American political discourse, this whole idea that, we have to make reparations or, we have to settle with people for what we've taken and what we've done.
There is a hint there of, I think, an awareness that there's going to be some payback here of this theft of lands and this violence and this imposition and invasion, and I think that let's live that out. Let's look at what is come of the past, where we are in the present, and where we're going in the future. The guideline though, and I think that we just can't overgloss this. Is that one of the guidelines that the producers had is that the Lone Ranger shall use perfect grammar and precise speech, completely devoid of slang and colloquial phrases. So I want you to know that out of everything, I'm going to hold you to that.
Okay, so no bad words.
No appearing in a saloon.
No appearing in a saloon. My hand is shaking already just at the thought of that. Listen, I was happy after we decided we were doing this. I was happy that the Lone Ranger hadn't been canceled. Okay, that was my big fear. Like, okay, we're doing this, and then Google machine, okay, Lone Ranger canceled. No, I mean, Johnny Depp came dangerously close. But I think that film version has been canceled essentially.
I think you can't do those. You just can't do those kinds of narratives anymore. No. So what we need to do is remake it, which is what we're doing right here.
That's what we're doing right here. So it's going to be an interesting journey. We're going to be adding pieces and taking pieces away as we go along. I would like to say, I'm very proud to say though that we have our first storyteller. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but this is the very first installment of The Storytellers.
Enjoy.
Hi, I'm Paul Simin, editor of the Winnipeg Free Press, and this is The Storytellers. Prior to being the editor, I spent 10 years in Ottawa. Part of the job when you're the eyes and ears of the Winnipeg Free Press on Parliament Hill is to not just look at the story of the day, but try and find the stories that matter to Manitobans. Try and have that sort of provincial prism so that you're bringing home stories that matter to Manitobans, help them explain their world, give them information that they can't get anywhere else. And this story that Dan has convinced me to tell was one of my bigger stories and also potentially the most embarrassing story. So I'm going to go back. It's 2006. Stephen Harper is Canada's Prime Minister, and he's making a Supreme Court. There's a vacancy. Thank you. Edit that out if need be. On the Supreme Court, and I find out that it's going to a Manitoban. So I've got a pretty big scoop here. So Marshall Rothstein, who had been on the federal court, is about to be named to the Supreme Court. So we have that story on the front page. But it's not just a nominee to the Supreme Court. It's a change in how Canada puts people on the highest court, because it's not just simply going to be a decision that comes down from on high. It's going to be a decision that has to go through a parliamentary committee. And there's lots of controversy surrounding this, because suddenly we're going to Americanize, that's the criticism from outside, what happens with our Supreme Court nominees. And so Marshall Rothstein's going to have to go before a House of Commons committee. Now, if anyone's watched the sideshows that are Supreme Court nominations in the United States, you can think of Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh and more recently Ketanji Brown Jackson. A lot can go on. And there were concerns that this was going to happen to Marshall Rothstein. So I'm now, having broken this story, I am now covering his appearance before the House of Commons. And he does really well. And there's none of the sort of the antics that we've seen in the U.S. experience. File my story. Everything's good. Wake up in the morning and there's an email from a reader. And the woman says, Paul, I want to thank you. I haven't been able to stop laughing this morning since reading your story. And I now understand why there was a subhead on the story that said it was like a love-in. I'm scratching my head thinking, what on earth is this woman talking about? Now, bear in mind, I don't get the Free Press delivered to my home in Ottawa. Our carriers do not have that sort of capacity. So I need to go online and I'm looking at the story. And I have the story here. So this is from 2006. I'm going to start. So Justice Marshall Rothstein made history yesterday as he sailed through an unprecedented parliamentary review of his Supreme Court nomination by relying on a mix of humor, prairie charm, and 40 years of legal experience. A pretty good lead, I might add. Now, I have to preface this that the subhead said it was like a lovin'. Now, that's really important because the reader said, I now understand why the headline in part said it was like a lovin'. Next graph. Surrounded by a crush of reporters as he arrived for the televised cross-examination, Rothstein joked that the media attention was a bit humbling for someone used to watching people file out of rooms when he was about to make a speech. Okay, I'm not laughing here. Third paragraph becomes a problem. But over the next 3 hours, the first ever nominee for the High Court to face a pubic grilling wowed MPs with his humility, respect for Parliament's role, and dim view of judicial activism. Pubic grilling. I am surprised to this day that I was never hauled up for contempt of court, and I'm just thankful that I never had to appear before Marshall Rothstein and the rest of his colleagues on the Supreme Court. Because, ironically, if you read that story and you were to believe that it was pubic as opposed to public, it was public humiliation for me. But exactly that story, all the concerns about what would happen with the nomination, Clarence Thomas never had to go through something like that.
This is an important moment in the evolution of any podcast. This is our first feature interview. So this is the part, like, if you're going to mess up on anything, don't mess up on... This would be
the one.
No, don't mess up on...
Okay, don't do this. This is not the right.
Okay, clearly we need to have more pre-recording meetings. No, don't mess up on this. So we wanted to go big game hunting, right? Big name, somebody, opinion leader, somebody who's been there, done that. And I was going to say we couldn't find anybody like that, but that's not true.
Donald Trump?
No.
Donald Trump wasn't available?
No,
Come on, you could get him.
No, he told us he wouldn't appear on the podcast unless it was live.
Oh, okay.
No, so we are extremely blessed and fortunate to have former Premier Gary Doer, former Ambassador Gary Doer, with us on the podcast today, and this is going to be the most effortless interview of all time, because there isn't a subject that Gary could not inform our podcast listening public on,
or fake,
informing. Absolutely, yeah.
So
you've hung around with too many journalists.
I have, and
absolutely.
yeah,
This is also
gotta have a story.
This is also the interview with the most amount of lead up ever, because we have met with you a number of times and said, hey, well, the podcast is coming, and I'm glad that you finally were able to join us.
Well, in the name of integrity, do we have to name the bar we met at before to prepare for the session?
Not unless they become a sponsor.
I believe that the post-production edit will take care of that.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Well, it'll be fully disclosed.
Anyways, Gary, welcome and good morning, this early morning.
God, it's the middle of the night. I was at the Ukrainian
There's lots of parking
last night, and it was wonderful. So
yep.
I'm ready to roll.
Ukrainian Gala. So ostensibly, I mean, I think we might shift gears a little bit, but ostensibly, we are now, the podcast will go live a little less than a week before the U.S. midterms. And I think U.S. midterm elections are one of those subjects that everybody in Canada is fascinated about. I mean, it's kind of like a combination roller derby and circus and politics, and the characters are bigger than life. Anyways, and I mean, you spent how many years as ambassador to
6.5 years?
Okay,
double overtime.
I didn't get to Wikipedia this morning, but seriously. So the first question I was going to ask you is it almost a law, like a rule of U.S. politics, that whatever party holds the White House gets creamed in the midterm election? So 2 years after any party wins the White House, they get murdered in the midterm. Is that basically what happens?
It generally does happen that way. And when I arrived in Washington, I'd just been there a couple of weeks, and it was the first set of midterms for President Obama. And that's where he came out with his very famous statement. We were shellacked. There was a shellacking going on. And I actually had to meet with him the next day, and he was still talking about the shellacking. So it does have an impact, and usually, particularly in the House of Representatives, which is a Congress, the incumbent president loses seats, and from where they gain seats when they won the presidency, because the down ticket votes were, if you're being elected president, the down ticket votes are helpful for the incoming president.
So is that, I mean, I have very distinct memories of the shellacking.
Yes.
And I mean, so Obama gets elected, first African-American president of all time, incredible campaign, record voter turnout, and then 2 years he gets shellacked.
Yes.
Is that just because whatever a president says or does as a candidate to get elected president, that they can't live up to that? Or
no, I think it's just that you wear all the things that are bothering people. But it doesn't necessarily follow, coming back to your original question. If you look at Bill Clinton, he was able to turn the tables on the midterm elections and make Newt Gingrich's contract with America the part of the vote determining issue. So when you look at Obama, he was in the middle of a financial crisis. And, what was happening in the United States is you had these massive bailouts of the financial institutions in New York, and you had people losing about 40% of the values of their homes or properties outside of Washington and New York. And I think to some degree, the president didn't get aggressive on taking on Wall Street and left himself vulnerable to the people who thought there was nobody on their side. So there are examples like Clinton, where you went out there and fought for that midterm, and examples where if you're passive, you're going to get hit even harder.
Yeah, and probably lost a lot of the goodwill of the taking the election in just a few years previous. It's funny how all that goodwill quickly dissipates when it gets to issues of people's homes and the economy. It seems like just same thing in Canada, that whenever the issue of the economy comes in, the issues are mostly around goodwill of the first black president, and all that kind of dissipates. Do you think that there's an issue this time around that's still reliving from the Obama days, or from we would never get a Donald Trump without Barack Obama.
Well, you also had Hillary Clinton running against him, who I have a lot of respect for. Smart, intelligent, funny, but you didn't see that on stage. So, and I thought the Democrats in general had moved away. They replaced one H, hard hats, with another H, Hollywood, in the second term. And I think Trump was able to attach himself to the hard hats in, they call it the Rust Belt states. They're not the Rust Belt states.
Pennsylvania.
They're the Great Lakes states. And I think that they lost that vote. Biden was the perfect candidate to take on Trump, because when I was in Washington, he, as vice president, was always connected to the hard hats. His endorsations were from steel workers, which of course have members in Canada. His endorsations were the firefighters, the international firefighters, Schaetberger. He had the hard hats endorsing him, helping him to win the nomination. But more importantly, for the American public, and for the Canadian public for that matter, he was the only person that the Democrats could have nominated to run for president that could have beaten Trump in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, all the seats that are states that Hillary Clinton lost to Trump the previous term.
Not Bernie Sanders, you're saying, is it?
Well, it is interesting because you've almost had two takeovers, corporate takeovers, of the major political parties in the United States. You have Bernie Sanders, not a member of the Democratic Party, almost took over the Democratic Party, and then was reluctant to support actively Hillary Clinton. If at best you could say he and Elizabeth Warren were late to the party in that election against Trump. And then you had, of course, Donald Trump take over the Republican Party. And, and he took it over with slogans. I'm digressing about a family story, but I had a picture of Hartley Richards and myself and Jeb Bush at the embassy, and I showed it to Kate when I came back from Washington. She'll kill me when she hears this. And I said, "Who are these people?" And she said, "Well, that's you, Dad. That's Hartley Richards. And this is low energy Jeb." She didn't even know him as Jeb Bush, former governor, son of the president. So it tells you, and a developer I know in New York who's got great ties to Winnipeg. I said, what kind of developer is Trump, when he was thinking of running? And he said, he's not a developer. I'm a developer. He's a marketer. All he'll do is market. And you can see he did that in the election. He did it to win the nomination. He did it in the election, and he's doing it now throughout the internal affairs of the Republican Party.
And he also is, his flirtation with we're running again is the most market-driven campaign, because he's far more interested in people talking about him potentially running than doing the actual running. By showing up over and over again at different, like popping up, it's like whack-a-mole, right? So he sort of pops up at this event, says, "Oh, I'm thinking about running," or he's thinking about doing this, or this race is overshadowed by will Trump run again, and who is he endorsing? Georgia, the entire Georgia election is based on that question, and whether Herschel Walker, who's the Republican candidate there, which the Democrats took Georgia Biden was able to somehow, whether disputed or not, and this will Raphael Warnock, really, you don't hear the term Raphael Warnock, you hear, will Herschel Walker win with Trump's endorsement there or not? This whole overshadowing in this midterms around the issue of Trump, this cannot be denied, right?
Well, first of all, Trump helped the Democrats win both Senate seats to then Georgia, get the 50 votes in the last election after Biden won. And his continued effort to turn over the vote in Georgia and attack the popular governor of Georgia, who's running again, I think helped the Democrats get to 50. And of course, the advantage of that is with the vice president, you've got the tiebreaker and you control the Senate. This time around, I actually think Georgia is going to continue to be fascinating for the reasons you raised about Trump and Herschel Walker, his candidate. But also, there's a libertarian vote there. And if the libertarian vote is 4%, 5%, God forbid, we might have another runoff where the whole Senate comes down to Herschel Walker and Warnock in Georgia. We may have another runoff, and I don't see a lot of pundits talking about that. So maybe I'm wrong because I'm not there anymore, although I was in the States last week. So you could have a Senate not determined on November the 8th and a couple of days after when all the votes are counted, hopefully, and you could then have another runoff in Georgia. I predicted 50-50 Senate in the last election, but I did not predict both seats going in Georgia going to the Democrats. The only one I know that did was former U.S. ambassador to Canada, who also grew up partly in Canada, Gordon Giffen. He predicted that. So on the record, he's the right pundit to get.
Yeah, Georgia's in it, but I mean, I think this is being played out all over the United States. Yes. But it is interesting that so you've got all these macro forces. You've got Trump. You've got Biden's declining popularity. You've got inflation and other economic problems. You've got Roe v. Wade. You've got the U.S. Decision on striking down access to abortion. And gun control is also playing in there. So you've got all these macro forces coming along. The New York Times did a poll last week that tried to find out which constellation of issues was more important: the economic issues headed by inflation, or the ideological issues headed by abortion. And it appears that they're angry about inflation, and that's what's going to drive them to determining their vote, which is weird because of all the things that are circling around. That's the one thing that the government probably has least amount of control over. Is that like when you're talking to people in the United States, what do they think the issues are that are really going to determine this election?
I think certainly the economy, the cost of gasoline always worries any incumbent president, any incumbent party. Is kind of a bumper sticker issue in any election campaign in the United States, and dare I say it, in Canada. A lot of these issues that you've talked about. Affordability is definitely an issue, and of course, and who's on my side on those issues? I come back to Obama, not visibly taking on Wall Street when people were suffering, and I think he learned from that because he won obviously the midterms in his second term. I think that another issue that is really a wedge issue in a lot of congressional seats and in the Senate is crime. And even though some of these states that have Republican governors have higher crime rates than other states that have Democratic, on a per capita basis, Democratic governors, crime is an issue, and it has been since some of the congressional Democratic members, after the horrible tragedy of the Floyd killing in Minneapolis, after they went on a major campaign to defund the police. And it almost cost the Democrats the House when Biden was elected. But it is definitely making a difference. What are the Republicans advertising on? They're not putting up Joe Biden's approval rating, or they're advertising on crime, and you're not safe. And even in New York State, there's a major race for governor, and it's being fought over the perceptions of crime and who's responsible.
I didn't want to interrupt you there because there was a really great report that came out around the crime rates, and the crime rates are actually quite low across the board even in the United States. But yet the perception that things are worse than ever is really the issue around crime. And that's so interesting because it speaks a lot to, I think, what the Republicans' game plan is, which is to play more on perception than reality. And that is the number one way I think they've been able to get. They're predicted to get 70% to win 70%. So they have a 70% chance to win the Senate. And those are generally sort of overall betting polls, so on. That they say.
Much betting on TV now. I can watch a hockey game.
Well, that's why we invited our own handicapper here today.
You know what the funny thing is? I equally see on coverage and media, not just polls. And I think that, if you look at the recent mayoral election here in Winnipeg, the polls got it almost completely, like there was either a radical shift almost overnight,
or the polls just got it wrong. And the polls seem to be faulty time and time again. So it's almost like looking at betting sites is almost as legitimate, which is what media are doing now. They're looking at ways in which others...
I'm going to want to circle back to that maybe in a future episode.
Yeah, I've got some opinions. I've got some opinions on polls too.
When we have Scott Gillingham on. Sorry.
Yeah, no.
Well, my point is just that the Republicans play a lot on perception, and I think are able to paint issues as quite black and white when they aren't black and white.
They're not. But
they do very well. I mean, it's an incredible game plan that they keep over time and time again winning.
Well, and that's why I said the word perception, because you can get crime rates on a per capita basis lower in a state where the Democrats are vulnerable on it. So you're absolutely right. But, in politics, and one of the problems with polls, you have all these substantive issues, the growth of the economy, the percentage of GDP, and the unemployment rate, and the inflation rate, and all these other things. Politics, your vote is just as emotional, if not more so, than it is, on data-driven numbers. And, and that's good because you're trying to vote for somebody that you think represents your values writ large. And that is in both in terms of party, but also in terms of people that are on the ballot. And emotion is a lot more effective, and those are hard to measure.
Is it the same though? I also saw something come out yesterday around the mail-in ballots.
Yes.
Right. And apparently, what the numbers are saying in most of those, there's about 10 swing states or 10 states that will determine the Senate this time around, and the mail-in ballots apparently are way up. And just like during the pandemic, where you saw mail-in ballots shift the presidential election, virtually, Trump went into the evening leading, comes out at 6 a.m. losing. And mail-in ballots seem to be something that's a determinant factor in the last one, and it's quite high apparently. Are mail-in ballots that same kind of emotional decision as it would be in the voting booth? I mean, perhaps it is. I think people probably decide weeks before where they're going to lean or how they're going to, and whether it be a social issue or an economic issue. But this time around, it seems like mail-in ballots are going to be an issue as well this time.
Well, I think they are. There's no question that the Republicans are better at turning out their vote on election day. Mm-hmm. And part of it's average ages and
that's why they challenge
more time
all
and
the advanced voting.
But it would be interesting because one of the states that will be really interesting to look at that question you raised is on mail-in versus that day of the election is going to be Pennsylvania, because there was a really tough debate. I would have argued. I was actually talking to a Republican friend on Monday, and he said, "Would you advise Fetterman to go into that debate?" And I said no. People know him. He's been lieutenant governor for 18 years. They know he's got a stroke. But a debate is not the place you want to test drive your,
But
your
then
health.
he went into the debate.
If you can help it, you don't want to test drive.
But then
your
he
health.
went into the debate.
He went into the debate. So it'll be interesting to see, because there'll be lots of votes that were mailed in advance of that debate, and then it'll be really interesting to test what happened at the debate, whether it was right or wrong to show up and have that what was painful to watch exercise that could determine the Senate. Because I think Nevada is going to go Republican, and that is going to be a real wake-up call, because the Democrats are losing. They're still getting more Latino voters, but they're losing the percentage of Latino voters that they traditionally got. And in Nevada, they have a Latino candidate, but they're losing the Latino vote.
And I mean, Fetterman, the issues are so related to the major criticisms that Republican or red states tend to have around Biden, is that he's incapable, his health is declining, that he's not fit for office. But then at the same time, I mean, fitness for office doesn't seem to be of much concern strategically for Republicans in Georgia. I mean, anyone who's watched Herschel Walker's campaign knows that there's nobody that seems more incapable of office They even had Barack Obama this past week.
I'd rather hand him the ball than hand him the Senate.
Is that a diagnosis?
Well, I mean, I mean, Barack Obama this past weekend was out even criticizing Herschel Walker, saying you'd never give him anything to do outside of carrying a football.
Well, did he? I would concur with that. But it's going to be, Georgia is going to be, as I say, it could even have another runoff for the Senate. It's hard to predict. But, with Fetterman, you mentioned Joe Biden. Joe Biden is an asset in Pennsylvania. The guy from Scranton, Pennsylvania, he is an asset there. He isn't an asset in some other states. So it doesn't hurt Fetterman on the issue of electability. Yeah. But, it's interesting because Fetterman took the high road here, with a guy named Oz. You could have sort of refused to say, I'll do that debate, but I'll do it in New Jersey where Oz lives instead of, but he didn't do that. I would have taken a cheap shot, but I am not worthy.
Who's coming back from the wilderness at this point? I think Republicans would like to play that they are the ones bringing the issues back, and there's this huge comeback of social values, and I think it's epitomized by the Roe versus Wade. By the way, there's way more things the Supreme Court have done other than that, but they've been overshadowed by Roe versus Wade, the overturning of that. I mean, the impact that the Supreme Court has had on Indigenous rights in the United States has been, just turning things back over 2.5 centuries overnight has been absolutely brain numbing. But is that more fitting for what's happening for the Democrats or the Republicans? Meaning they're coming back from a long series. I think they generally think of the Obama years as this years of darkness, or the years of the woke mob taking over the U.S. White House, and then Trump comes back, and they see that as this moment of the little guy winning, even though he's not in any ways a little guy.
That was the era of the drunk mob.
Well, you see the rise of, we'll call it U.S. patriotism in its most white supremacist form in lots of ways, and particularly, but in particular states, those seen as it's the real America coming back, right? But you also see the Democrats playing that story too. You see, even though they're in power, but you see the Democrats going, well, we need to take America back, and we need to do it one step at a time. We need to do it every one state at a time. Which do you think is more, at this point, compelling? That story? Is it the Democrats coming back, even though they seem to have the measure of power, or keeping that? Or is it that the Republicans are, the pendulum is swinging back towards the Republicans, which it tends to do in the United States, like 8 years of Democrats, 8 years of Republicans, and so on?
Well, I think there's some very important issues you raised with that question, and the analysis of what's going on. And just to cut to one part of the chase here, that's why the Senate is so important. So the Democrats have an advantage because they already have, if they get to 50, they keep the Senate because they have the vice president. The Republicans have got to get to 51, so they have to they might have a little more of a challenge on these swing states on takeaways than the Democrats do. But the Supreme Court appointments, all the appointments, have to go through the Senate, and so some of these issues of values and culture and patriotism and the United States' place in the world, those issues sometimes now are being determined by the Supreme Court. And I think it's a real crucial moment, over the next decade, of whether the Supreme Court becomes a branch plant of a political party with the appointments that are made. And that is a huge issue, because there were votes that took place for generations in the Supreme Court. You could argue had a balance of the American values and law and public, including the Affordable Health Care Act with Roberts' decision a few years ago. We're at a real juncture on the Supreme Court, and this Senate race will have a lot to do with it. I think we're at a real also tipping point on foreign affairs. You have the Republicans now running for the House which the Republicans are going to win the House. And whether it's 25 or more seats, we'll have to see. But there is a split. There's two big splits that have an impact on the world. One is the debt ceiling. And you have a right-wing part of the Republican Party that do not want to do anything on the debt ceiling, which could affect the economies of many countries, including Canada. And you have the whole issue of Ukraine. I was met some friends yesterday in Winnipeg at the Congress. I mean, they're really worried, and it should be. We should all be worried about Republicans dropping support dealing with the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And so these are very, very important. Those are a couple of answers to the broad issues that you've raised, including patriotism. It wasn't long ago that Romney was the one that said to Obama that the biggest risk to U.S. security was Russia, and he got, flicked away like a foreign object in Obama's salad and saying, the Cold War is dead, and you got to worry about ISIS and everything else.
Yeah.
So we're at a really interesting point, which has an impact on the world and, of course, on their neighbor and ally, Canada.
I can't emphasize enough how the untalked about or the least talked about issue in the U.S. election on the ground is Putin's affiliation with Trump and the past relationship. And of course, North Korea is doing missile tests over Japan and doing it with impunity as sort of a sign. It's almost like it's a political expression. And we know that with Russia interfering with U.S. elections, I mean, there is clear intent of the world to invest itself within a U.S. election. And it appears in certain sectors to support the Republican Party at strategic times. And that's maybe a huge allegation, but I feel there's enough evidence to suggest that the ramping up of Putin's yesterday I heard him talking about there was an announcement about him talking about strategic radioactive weapons and not nuclear, but dirty bombs.
The dirty bombs, which has always been a fear in the United States.
And that Putin's talking about these dirty bombs, and suddenly it's a week before week and a half before the U.S. midterms. I mean, all of that seems strategic and uncoincidental.
Yeah, and there's some really important. You mentioned North Korea and you mentioned Russia. When Russia scrambles planes over the Arctic, we don't have the capacity with the CF-18 to deal with them. And of course, then from Colorado Springs, where there's Canadian commanders, we scramble the F-35s to, let them know we know you're there and you're not to come any further. Now we're in a little debate about nexus at the border and sovereignty. My God, sovereignty. We ask the Americans to please come up here and let the Russians know that, we're going to stand up to them. And then you mentioned North Korea. Ever since North Korea has developed the ballistic missiles that have capacity to go to the West Coast, why aren't we doing something about signing the missile defense system? This is a New Democrat arguing for a missile defense system. Counterintuitive, I would suggest. But, and I think...
Not the first time either.
Yes, well, I think Minister Anand is actually on it. I think the great job she did on procurement for vaccines, I'm glad she's the defense minister right now, because I think she will take a mature stand on this and not just have a resolution at a Liberal convention from youth delegates to determine the foreign policy of Canada, which happened under my good friend Paul Martin. So it is very, these issues of security are very, very important for Canada, and it does. I'm just trying to not just talk about the United States, but what are we going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? And I think we've got to look at ourselves a little bit in the mirror too. We can't have it both ways. We can't have the love, trust, pixie dust policy and then be scared of hell of Russia, which we should be, with being a fellow Arctic nation.
So, the threats from outside the United States or outside North America are pretty horrifying. I got to tell you, though, that and maybe I'm underestimating those threats, but that's not what worries me the most about these midterms and then in 2 years in the presidential elections. The threat from within, and in particular, the systemic, organized efforts to undermine the integrity of elections, and the number of 2020 presidential election result deniers who are specifically running to obtain positions, Secretary of State and Lieutenant Governor positions that would have control over the way and means of vote counting, the organized efforts that are, basically the Republicans have busloads of lawyers, ready to go to court to challenge any result that they don't agree with. I mean, are American institutions still strong enough to withstand?
I think they are in the long run. In the short run, these elections, again, we were talking about the midterms, coming back to the midterm topic. These elections are really important. The governor of Pennsylvania is going to be just as important as the elected senator. The lieutenant governor positions in a number of states, because they are the chief electoral officer, are very important. A lot of these governors are very, very important. So they have an impact on elections. And I come back to the Supreme Court. Dan, you as a person who's worked, and again, have worked on issues of wrongful convictions, we would need a Supreme Court with complete integrity. As I say, I do not want it to slide into the perception and reality of being a branch plant of a political party.
Turning to, as we wrap up here and we're talking about the midterms, it's funny that so many states that in the past have been questioned or questionable results. Some of them are quite clear. I think we generally Ohio is considered that kind of in a presidential election as the purple state, as the which way is it going to go. This way it's fairly clear, and Ohio's been Republican for quite a while. And what are the three most important things you're going to watch on election night, and why should we watch them? Like, as people who are up here in Canada watching the U.S. midterms, and it can get really overwhelming. It can get really, I think most people that I speak to just generally go like, I don't know what to watch there. What are three things that, as a Canadian, as a person who's heavily ensconced in U.S. politics, what are three things that a person should watch, or three states that they should watch?
Well, the three states they should watch are actually, except for Nevada. Of course, I would argue some Canadians have some contact with Nevada. I looked at the fact when we were getting a rough time by a Nevada politician. I looked at it, and Canada was the largest foreign visitor to Las Vegas of any country. So I used that.
Don't mess with
I used the.
I don't know
tunishly in
that
the
hasn't
Nevada
gone there.
media. But beyond that, the Great Lakes states, are border states, and so you come back to Ohio. Sherrod Brown's a Democrat. He's the incumbent, one of the incumbents. Ryan is a very popular former congressperson who's running now for the Senate against Vance, who was supported by Trump. This is a state we worked with for a while on a lot of issues. Pennsylvania is a border state, part of the Great Lakes Coalition. So is Ohio. Michigan, you've got Line 5, which I don't think is going to be as important with the governor. You're probably aware of this. There's a dispute now in Wisconsin of Line 5 from an indigenous group, which I think Canada has to pay more attention to, in terms of solving it, because it goes back. They weren't involved in the original pipeline treaty between Canada and the United States. But I would say the Great Lakes states are very important, including New York, where there's actually much more of a close race for governor than we would think. Now, governors are really helpful to Canada on the border states. They have supported us on getting a waiver for Buy America. I had unions, starting with the steelworkers in Selkirk, helped us with Biden get a waiver for Buy America under the Recovery Act of Obama when Biden was vice president and Pelosi was Speaker of the House. So the unions and the governors are very important for us, particularly if you have just partisan votes in the Senate and the Congress. So those state elections include not only the Senate and the Congress. And I think the Congress is gone for the Democrats. It's going to the Republicans. It's just a question of degree and messaging. Why did some of these seats go? The Senate, as I say, it's going to be, it might come down to Georgia. It might come down to, I think Arizona is going to stay Democrat. It's going to be, but the Senate will have a lot to do with it. The Senate, for example, the Senate approves the appointment of the ambassador to Canada. All appointments go through the Senate. And if Biden loses that authority with losing the Senate, he's going to lose a lot of his authority of being president and his ability to make decisions. He'll be commander-in-chief, but he won't be able to pass the infrastructure bill that he passed. The government, U.S. government, passed billions of dollars of investments into chips, into technology, into a strategy to deal with China's technology innovations to be competitive. I mean, what are we doing in Canada right now? We're debating a dental plan, and the United States is debating the future. Now, God knows my teeth need a dental plan. But having said that, I don't believe that are we building a future? Yeah, and my dentist will hear this. Yeah. And are we just dealing with status quo old issues?
Well, thanks for that. We didn't know we were going to break news today, but apparently your dental status is news now.
Well, I've chipped teeth from hockey.
Oh, okay. Well, I
That's
feel
my
your,
excuse for being
I feel
lazy.
your pain.
Lazy with the toothbrush.
Yeah. Well, and the long list of things you've accomplished in your career, this long and impressive resume. Right down at the bottom now, there's a small entry where you were the very first feature interview subject in the Niigaan and the Lone Ranger podcast.
I don't know why can I say that politically correctly? Because I'm a woke politician. Am I in trouble?
No,
am I in trouble here?
You should really listen to the opening.
Is your city editor going to edit this kind of title? What's the deal going on here?
It's 2022,
I could not repeat
and it's
that
now
title.
fine.
What's that?
I will give you absolute to put this on your resume, your CV, and you can put a little picture of my face right there if you want. So
that's right.
Perfect. This is you're worth some votes there, man.
Yeah.
You're worth some columns. I mean, I'm shameless.
Yeah.
I'll go for everything.
This is insight to the podcast because I just go like, and Niigaan thumbs up or thumbs down, right? So he's the arbiter. But anyways, Gary, thank you so much. Couldn't have imagined a better person to come on and help us break the ice with this podcast. And we hope to be back in the near future. I refuse to commit us to an exact cadence
or location.
Well, as long as we have our advance work done in a bar.
Yes.
Over a beer. Not more than one, but just a beer. Because,
wink,
life's too short.
Nudge.
Life is too short to be too serious.
No. One beer is just a, hey, how's you doing? 2 beers is a working meeting, okay? So that's what we have to do. Anyways, Gary.
I really liked it. Really enjoyed it.
Okay. And thank you to
Lone Ranger. Yeah. I'm not going to get it.
No, okay. You should listen.
The city editor is not going to like this. That's all I know.
Just listen to the opening segment of the podcast, and that'll explain everything.
All right.
Thanks very much, Gary.
Thanks
to Niigaan. Thanks to Adam Glynn and the folks at CJNU for our supporting us in our inaugural podcast, and we will be back.
We'll be back. Yeah. I could tell you some Arnold stories.
Yeah, okay. Part 2 of the Gary Dewar podcast will apparently be coming next week.
He wears more makeup than any date I ever had. Don't tell anybody.